The restaurant sat on the corner of an old street, its windows glowing with soft yellow light, even after most other shops had closed for the night. The smell of grilled meat and fresh bread lingered in the cool air, mixing with the faint odor of the rain-soaked pavement. Inside, the clatter of plates had finally gone quiet, and the last of the customers had left hours ago. Only the hum of a refrigerator and the sound of a broom brushing across the floor filled the space. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another small, family-owned place, unremarkable in the bustle of the city. But for the man who owned it, this little restaurant was more than work. It was his pride, the one thing he believed he had built with his own hands, something solid in a life that hadn't always felt steady. He was a man in his 40s, tired but not yet beaten down by time. Years of running the place showed in the lines on his face, the way he carried stress in his shoulders, and the calluses on his hands. He was respected by the locals, known for occasionally giving free meals to regulars who had fallen on hard times. Yet beneath that surface of generosity was someone who never let people get too close, someone who had learned that kindness could be taken advantage of. He told himself he was cautious, not cold, but sometimes he caught the way others looked at him, as if they thought he kept walls higher than necessary. That night, as he pushed the mop across the tiles, he kept glancing at the door. The street outside was tranquil, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as though something was waiting to happen. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to shift in ways he couldn't imagine. Outside, sitting near the entrance, was a figure wrapped in a worn coat, the fabric frayed at the cuffs and darkened by years of use. Beside her, curled into the coat as if trying to disappear, was a child. Their shoes were muddy, their hair damp from the drizzle, and their faces hidden in the shadows. They had been sitting there for almost an hour, unnoticed by most who hurried past. The grandmother, if that's what she was, looked old in the kind of way that life hardens people, not just from age. Her hands shook as she tried to shield the child from the cold, but she kept her back straight, as though refusing to bend under the weight of pity. They didn't belong there, not in this part of town where neon lights blinked above bars and cabs sped down slick streets. People usually avoided eye contact with those who looked like they had nowhere to go, as if acknowledging them would force a choice: help or walk away. Tonight was no different. A few glanced in their direction, then quickly turned their heads, pulling coats tighter, pretending not to see. The man inside noticed them when he stepped out to throw the trash. He paused, trash bag in hand, when his eyes met the woman's. For a moment, neither looked away. Something about her stare unsettled him. It wasn't begging, it wasn't even pleading. It was sharp, steady, and filled with a quiet defiance, as though daring him to look longer, daring him to turn away like everyone else had. He wanted to. His first instinct was to step back inside, close the door and lock it. But the child shifted then, resting their head against the woman's lap, and something in that small, tired movement cut through him. The city had its way of burying people, of making lives like theirs invisible, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, if he didn't act now, no one else would. He didn't yet know who they were, or what story had brought them to his doorstep. He didn't know what secret sat behind the old woman's eyes, or what kind of wounds the child carried, silent and unseen. And he didn't know that letting them into his world, even for a single night, would change everything he thought he understood about kindness, trust, and the fine line between saving someone and being destroyed by them. Still, he unlocked the door, hesitated for a breath, and spoke words that would set the stage for everything to come. "Come inside," he said quietly. "Just for tonight." The air seemed to thicken after that, as though those words had shifted the balance of something larger than the moment. The restaurant, warm and familiar, was about to hold more than just the smell of food and the echo of laughter. It was about to hold desperation, secrets, and choices that could not be undone. And though everything looked ordinary, the clinking glasses drying on shelves, The chairs stacked neatly on tables, the neon glow leaking in through the window. There was a shadow already forming at the edges of that night. A shadow that would grow, pulling each of them deeper into a story that began with an act of mercy, but would end with consequences none of them could escape. The first night passed in uneasy silence. The woman and child sat at one of the corner tables, eating the soup he had placed before them without a word. The man had retreated to the kitchen, pretending to be busy, himself with wiping counters that were already clean. Yet his ears were tuned to every sound, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl, the low hum of the woman's voice as she whispered to the child, the tired sigh that slipped out when she thought no one could hear. Something about their presence stirred him in ways he didn't understand. He told himself it was only one night. But when dawn came, and they were still there, asleep against each other on the padded booth, he couldn't bring himself to wake them. At first, he thought it harmless. What was another night? The child's small face, hollow with hunger, had already carved itself into his memory. Still, he felt the weight of the decision, like letting them stay meant crossing a line he couldn't step back from. His staff noticed within days. One of the waitresses, a young woman who had been with him for years, gave him a look when she saw the old woman sitting by the window, sipping coffee he hadn't charged her for. The whispers started soon after. Why was he letting strangers live in his restaurant? Who were they really? The old woman didn't speak much, but when she did, her words carried a strange sharpness. She was polite, almost grateful, but her eyes gave away something harder. The child was different, quiet, always observing, as though memorizing every detail of the place. Sometimes the man caught the boy staring at him, not with fear, but with a kind of searching intensity. It unsettled him more than he admitted. The first clash came one late evening when he tried to set rules. He told the woman she couldn't keep staying there every night. His voice was firm, trying to hide his unease, but she only stared at him, her thin lips pressing into a line. "Where do you want us to go?" she asked softly, almost too softly, but with a weight that pressed against him. He didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. He wanted to say it wasn't his responsibility, but the words lodged in his throat. He felt her gaze dig into him, testing how far his kindness would stretch. The child clung to her sleeve, watching the exchange silently, wide-eyed. Something in that moment shifted. The fragile balance between them tipped. Days turned into weeks, and what began as pity started to twist into something else. His regular customers noticed the boy helping wipe tables, carrying trays too heavy for his thin arms. Some praised the man's generosity, others muttered that it wasn't right. The man himself began to feel both pride and unease. He liked the child's presence, liked the way the boy followed his instructions, eager to be useful. But at night, when the restaurant was dark, he found himself lying awake, wondering why he hadn't forced them to leave. The old woman's influence grew too. She had a way of inserting herself into conversations, suggesting changes to the menu, hinting at ways to draw more business. At first he brushed it off, but slowly he realized some of her ideas worked. He hated to admit it, but she was clever, and that cleverness unsettled him. It wasn't long before the lines blurred. She began to speak as though she belonged there, referring to the place as ours, to the staff as though they answered to her. The man bristled, but he said nothing. Each time he tried to assert himself, her calm, steady stare broke him down. Rumors spread in the neighborhood. Some said the old woman was his relative. Others whispered that she had some hold over him, some secret that kept him from throwing her out. The more people speculated, the more isolated he felt. And the more isolated he felt, the deeper she seemed to root herself in his world. The first real fight happened when one of his oldest employees confronted him. The waitress who had worked there for years told him flat out that if the woman and child didn't leave, she would. The man, tired and tense, snapped back in a way he never had before. Words were exchanged, bitter and sharp, and by the end of the night, she had quit. He watched her walk out, apron tossed on the counter, and felt something crumble inside him. But when he looked toward the corner booth, the old woman was already watching, her face unreadable. From that moment, things tightened. What had once felt like charity now felt like a trap. He began to sense her presence everywhere, her voice in his ear, her judgment in her eyes, her steady hand on the boy's shoulder, as though to remind him of what he could never take away. Then came the secret. He didn't find out directly. It was another customer who let it slip, someone who recognized the woman from years ago in another part of town. The story was vague, filled with half-truths, but the implication was clear. She had been involved in something before, something that had ended badly. He confronted her that night, his voice rising for the first time. The boy sat at the table, head bowed, while the old woman listened without flinching. When he demanded the truth, she only gave him that same steady look. "Everyone has a past," she said. "Even you." Her words cut deep, sharper than he wanted to admit. He knew what she meant. He had his own secrets, things buried in his years before the restaurant, things he never spoke of, and somehow she seemed to sense it. That was when the unease turned into something darker. He began to fear her, not because of what she had done, but because she seemed to know him better than anyone else. The more he tried to push her out, the more bound to her he felt. It was as though by opening the door that first night, he had made a pact he couldn't escape. The child, caught in the middle, grew closer to him during this time. The boy followed him into the kitchen, asked questions about recipes, even smiled sometimes, a rare glimpse of innocence. But the more the man grew attached, the more the woman seemed to tighten her hold. He saw it in the way her hand lingered on the boy's shoulder, in the way her voice carried a warning whenever he got too close. The tension grew unbearable. Customers dwindled as rumors spread, employees left one by one, and the man found himself standing in an empty restaurant that felt less like his and more like theirs. And through it all, the old woman sat in her corner, watching, waiting, weaving herself deeper into his life until he could no longer see where his choices ended and hers be. Egan. Every night, he lay awake in his small apartment above the restaurant, listening to the hum of the refrigerators below, haunted by the thought that he had let something inside that would never leave. He didn't yet know what form it would take, how far it would go, but he could feel it coming. The breaking point. The night would come when words wouldn't be enough, when one decision would tear through everything he thought he controlled. And though he tried to pretend otherwise, deep down he knew. The storm was already here, and it was only a matter of time before it destroyed them all. The night the crime happened, the restaurant was silent in a way that felt wrong, as though the air itself held its breath. The neon signs outside flickered weakly, their light spilling across the rain-slick pavement. Inside, only a single bulb in the kitchen cast a pale glow, leaving the rest of the place in heavy shadow. The man stood behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. He hadn't slept in days. His body felt worn, but his mind burned with restless fury, circling the same thoughts until he thought he would tear himself apart. The old woman sat in her usual place, the corner booth by the window. The child was beside her, head resting on folded arms, asleep. She stroked the boy's hair slowly, her eyes never leaving the man. There was no warmth in her expression. She looked at him as if she already knew what was coming, as if she had been waiting for this night. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He demanded once again that she leave, that she stop poisoning his life, that she take the boy and go. His words tumbled out like broken glass, sharp, desperate and jagged. She only listened, her face calm, her hand steady on the child's back. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, deliberate, and laced with something that made his stomach twist. "You think you gave us shelter," she whispered, "but it was we who gave you purpose. Without us, you're nothing but an empty man in an empty restaurant." The words struck deeper than any knife. He staggered back as though she had physically struck him. Every insecurity, every buried regret came rushing up. He saw flashes of his past, the mistakes, the betrayals, the loneliness, and felt the walls closing in. His chest heaved as though he couldn't breathe. The boy stirred at the sound of his raised voice, blinking up in confusion. For a moment the man's anger faltered. The sight of the child's tired eyes softened something in him, a reminder of the reason he had opened that door weeks ago. But then he looked back at the woman, and her stare held him in place, cold, unrelenting. He thought he saw a hint of satisfaction flicker across her face, and that broke him. His hands moved before his mind could catch up. The kitchen knife had been left on the counter, glinting in the faint light. He grabbed it, his body trembling, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. He told himself it was just to scare her, just to make her leave. But Evie, and as he stepped forward, he knew it wasn't true. The old woman didn't move. She didn't scream or beg. She only straightened her back, her eyes locked on his. In that final moment, it was as if she was daring him, as if she had orchestrated everything to end right here, right now. The knife came down. The sound was muffled, a sickening thud against flesh, followed by the sharp gasp of air leaving her lungs. The boy screamed then, a sound so raw and piercing it seemed to shatter the walls around them. The man froze, staring at the blood blooming against her coat, the shock in the boy's eyes, the silence that followed her final breath. His chest burned as if fire had consumed him from the inside. The knife clattered to the floor, slipping from his shaking hands. His mind screamed denial. This wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't supposed to happen. But the reality was painted across the booth, dark and undeniable. The child scrambled away, his hands smeared with his grandmother's blood as he tried to shake her, whispering her name over and over. The man stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his vision blurring. He pressed his hands against his face, but the image of her eyes, still open, still fixed on him, wouldn't leave. Panic surged. He rushed to the sink, splashing water on his hands, scrubbing at the blood that wouldn't come off. His mind raced. He had to think. He had to fix this. He couldn't let anyone know. He turned back toward the booth, but the boy's wails anchored him to the spot. Every cry was a reminder of what he had done, of the innocence shattered in front of him. He thought about calling for help, but the thought twisted into fear. Help would mean questions. Questions would mean answers, and answers would mean prison. His breath grew shorter, the walls pressing in tighter. He grabbed a rag and tried to wipe the blood from the table, his hands shaking so badly the cloth smeared more than it cleaned. The boy's cries didn't stop. The sound clawed at his chest until he snapped. He shouted at him to be quiet, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. The child flinched, wide-eyed, and pressed himself into the corner of the booth. In that moment, the man saw the truth, written clearly in the boy's gaze. Fear. Not just fear of what had happened, but fear of him. He collapsed onto a chair, his head in his hands. His body shook with silent sobs, his breath hitching in uneven gasps. He wanted to believe he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that it was the heat of the moment. But deep down, he knew. The rage had been building for weeks, the pressure tightening around him like a vice. The crime wasn't an accident. It had been waiting, festering, inevitable. The minutes after stretched like hours. The restaurant, once a place of comfort, now reeked of iron and despair. Every shadow seemed to whisper what he had done. Every creak of the floor seemed like the footsteps of someone coming to take him away. He tried to think of a plan. Burn the rag, move the body, silence the boy. But each thought twisted darker, each one breaking against the reality that nothing could undo what had already happened. The boy sat frozen, his small hands still stained red, his eyes locked on the body beside him. The man couldn't bring himself to look again, couldn't face the stillness of the woman who had once held so much control over him. Yet he felt her there, her presence heavier in death than it had ever been in life, her silence louder than her words. And as the night pressed on, he realized something with chilling clarity. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a descent he couldn't escape, a chain of consequences that would unravel every piece of the life he thought he had built. The crime had been swift, but its shadow would stretch far longer than he could ever imagine. The hours after the crime bled together in a haze of fear and regret. The man sat slumped at one of the tables, his face buried in his hands, the metallic smell of blood still heavy in the air. The knife lay on the floor where he had dropped it, its blade streaked dark red. The woman's body hadn't moved since, her silence pressing into the room like a weight that suffocated everything else. The child was the only sound, soft, broken sobs that never seemed to stop. He kept telling himself it hadn't been his fault, that she had pushed him, cornered him, twisted everything until he snapped. But no matter how many times he whispered it under his breath, the truth always clawed back. His hand had held the knife, his rage had driven it forward. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm even as he lunged, as if she had expected it. The thought made him terse and sick. At dawn, he finally forced himself to move. His body shook as he dragged her lifeless form into the kitchen, wrapping it clumsily in a sheet. The boy followed, his small frame trembling, whispering her name over and over. The man couldn't bring himself to look at him. The child's gaze felt like judgment, like a mirror reflecting everything he wanted to deny. He snapped at him to go upstairs, his voice harsh, but the boy didn't move. He simply stood there, tears streaking his face, watching every movement. When the door finally shut behind the bundle, he carried into the back alley. The man thought he might collapse. He buried her beneath piles of discarded crates, covering the sheet with trash bags, praying no one would look too closely. Each scrape of wood against concrete echoed in his head, like the sound of a coffin closing. He told himself it was only temporary, that he would find a way to move her later, but deep down, he knew he was only delaying the inevitable. The boy's silence grew heavier in the days that followed. He barely spoke, barely ate, his eyes fixed on nothing, his small hands always clutched together, as if holding on to something unseen. The man tried to justify his actions, telling himself he had protected them both from her control, from the poison she had brought into their lives. But each time he said it, the boy's eyes seemed to contradict him. There was no gratitude in them, only fear. Word began to spread in the neighborhood. Customers noticed the woman's absence. At first they assumed she had finally left, but whispers began to form. Why hadn't she said goodbye? Where had she gone with the child always at her side? The man tried to keep the restaurant running, forcing smiles, cooking meals, pretending nothing had changed. But the cracks showed. He forgot orders, snapped at staff, and burned food he had made 1,000 times before. His regulars, ours, began to thin out, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare ask. The boy became the center of speculation. Some assumed he was the man's son. Others thought he was simply a stray he had taken in. The man didn't correct them. He let the assumptions swirl, hoping they would cover the truth. But the more people asked, the more paranoid he grew. He jumped at the sound of sirens passing outside, his hands trembling whenever the door swung open too suddenly. Nights became unbearable. Sleep never came. When he closed his eyes, he heard her voice, whispering that she had been right, that without her, he was nothing. The psychological toll began to unravel him. He stopped eating. His face grew hollow, his eyes sunken. He drank more than he ever had before, trying to numb the guilt that seeped into every corner of his mind. The boy watched quietly, his silence more damning than words. Sometimes, the man caught him staring with a look that made his stomach twist. Not hatred, not anger, but something colder. It was the look of someone who had already decided he could never forgive. The community's perception shifted quickly. At first, people had admired the man's generosity for sheltering the old woman and child. But as time passed and the questions about her disappearance deepened, admiration turned to suspicion. Murmurs spread through the town. Stories twisted into darker versions. Some claimed he had taken advantage of her. Others whispered that something sinister had happened behind those glowing windows. The media caught wind when someone anonymously tipped off a local reporter. Articles appeared, painting him as a man with a hidden side, a businessman who had let strangers into his life with motives no one fully understood. Photos of the restaurant appeared alongside headlines filled with words like mystery, disappearance, and tragedy. His reputation, once solid and respected, crumbled almost overnight. Legally, the noose tightened. Police began asking questions, first politely, then more firmly. They wanted to know when he had last seen the woman, why she had left the child behind, and why his answers always seemed hesitant. He told them she had moved on, found another place, another opportunity. But the detectives didn't believe him. Their eyes lingered too long. Their pens scribbled too much. The boy became the silent witness he feared most. The police questioned him too, but he said little, only staring at the table in front of him, his lips pressed tight. His silence raised more suspicion than words ever could. The man tried to control the narrative, tried to speak for him, but each time he did, it felt like he was digging himself deeper. The weight of guilt, fear and paranoia ate away at what little remained of him. He walked through his days like a ghost, his movements mechanical, his voice hollow. The restaurant, once alive with laughter and warmth, became a place of shadows. Chairs stayed empty, the kitchen cold. The few customers who still came avoided his eyes, their conversations hushed. The crime had not just taken one life, it had destroyed them all. The boy had lost the only family he knew. The community had lost trust in a man they once respected, and he had lost himself, consumed by guilt, haunted by a voice that would never leave him. In the end, there was no escaping the consequences. Every action he took to cover his crime only deepened the cracks. Every lie he told only brought him closer to the truth, and though he still walked the streets, still breathed the same air, he was already imprisoned by the memory of blood on his hands, by the eyes of a child who would never look at him the same way again. The story did not end in silence, though the man wished it had. The secret he tried to bury surfaced, as such things always do. The body was discovered weeks later, when the smell could no longer be ignored, when rats began to scatter from the alley where he had hidden her. Neighbors whispered, the police returned with sharper questions, and before long, the truth could no longer be contained. He was arrested in his own restaurant, hands bound behind his back as the few customers inside watched in stunned silence. The boy, small and pale, stood in the corner as officers led him away, his eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable. The trial drew attention quickly. Newspapers published every detail they could scrape together, from the man's quiet reputation to the whispers of what had happened behind closed doors. Some painted him as a monster who had taken in a vulnerable woman only to destroy her. Others described him as a man pushed too far, a victim of manipulation and mental torment who had finally snapped, but no article could change the fact that a woman was dead and a child had been left motherless in every sense. In court, the boy was brought forward as the most important witness. He did not tell long stories. He did not accuse or defend. He only answered questions in short, quiet words, his voice trembling but steady enough to confirm what mattered. He had seen the knife, seen the strike, seen his grandmother fall. The man could not meet his eyes. The child's voice, so small and broken, carried more weight than any lawyer's argument. The verdict was inevitable. The jury found him guilty, not of some distant, cold premeditation, but of a crime born of rage and weakness. He was sentenced to decades in prison. His restaurant was sold to pay legal fees, and his name was forever tied to the crime. For the community, he became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly generosity could curdle into tragedy, how thin the line was between kindness and destruction. The boy's future was uncertain. Social workers stepped in, trying to find relatives or a foster family willing to take him. He was shuffled from place to place, carrying with him not only the loss of his grandmother, but also the memory of the night he could never erase. Those who cared for him spoke of nightmares, of nights when he woke screaming, of days when he sat in silence, eyes distant, as though still trapped in the corner booth of that restaurant. His innocence had been stolen, not just by the crime, but by the weight of being its witness. The old woman, whose presence had once seemed so commanding, was reduced in the public eye to a victim. Yet whispers of her past continued. Some still said she had been manipulative, that she had pulled the man into a trap he could never escape. Others dismissed it as an attempt to excuse his violence. In the end, the truth of who she was became less important than the tragedy of how she died. For the man, prison was no true punishment. It was simply a continuation of the cage he had already built for himself. Guilt consumed him. Nights were endless, haunted by her voice and the boy's eyes. He tried at first to justify his actions, to tell himself it had been survival, self-defense of the spirit if not the body. But each time he tried to cling to that belief, he felt it crumble beneath the weight of reality. He had killed not because he had to, but because he had lost control. The broader impact rippled through the community. People who had once trusted easily began to look at kindness with suspicion. The story became a warning that even good deeds could turn dark, that mercy could open doors to ruin. Discussions sparked about how society treated its homeless, about the thin support systems in place, and about how desperation pushed people into dangerous circumstances. Some argued that if the city had offered the woman and child real shelter, none of it would have happened. Others countered that the man had chosen violence, and no circumstance could excuse it. At its core, the tragedy laid bare the fragile nature of morality. Power had shifted constantly between them, his in owning the restaurant, hers in her influence over the boy and her piercing control of him. Neither was innocent in their relationship. Both were bound by needs they didn't fully understand. And yet, when everything broke, the weight of responsibility fell on the one who had chosen to pick up the knife. The case forced reflection on the complexity of human behavior. People wanted neat answers, villain and victim, good and evil, but reality was tangled. The old woman had been both vulnerable and powerful, both in need of help and capable of manipulating it. The man had been both generous and violent, both savior and destroyer. The boy, caught between them, was left as the only figure who had no power, no choice, and yet bore the heaviest scars. Justice in the end was partial. The law punished the man, but it could not undo the crime. The boy would never have back the life he lost, nor the grandmother who had raised him. The community would never see the restaurant as it once was, filled with warmth and laughter, and the man would never be free from the weight of what he had done. Years later, the story was still remembered, not just as a crime, but as a lesson. It revealed how fragile the line is between compassion and destruction, how desperation and control can twist even the simplest acts into something dangerous. It showed how power dynamics in relationships, between men and women, adults and children, the housed and the homeless, could warp morality until no one was truly safe. In the end, the man who thought he was saving 2 lives had destroyed 3, the old woman's, the child's, and his own. The crime had begun with a single act of mercy, an unlocked door on a rainy night, but mercy without boundaries had opened the way for chaos. And so the story closed, not with answers, but with questions that lingered. What does it mean to help? At what point does kindness become control? And when does survival turn into something darker, something that can never be forgiven? The world moved on, but the shadow of that night remained, a reminder of the dangerous complexity of human nature, where good intentions can twist into tragedy and where one choice can change lives forever.